Thank you so much. Thanks to Daniele and Donatella. It looks like the video is not going to be working terribly well. I apologize for that on your end. I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks also to the Festivalfilosofia. The idea of philosophy, the love of knowledge, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. And it's particularly important for us to celebrate philosophy at this particular moment in time, because there is a challenge to philosophy, to knowledge, to science. We're told we live in a post-truth world. We see the rise of authoritarianism, increasing censorship. We see large amounts of falsehoods, memes, unreasoned dialogue. And because of all that, to have the possibility of talking to an audience that actually comes to listen to a lecture about philosophy is wonderfully heartening. So thank you for being there. I wish I could see you, but for whatever reason, they have only decided to show me. And I'm sure that I would much rather be looking at the square in Modena, which is what they told me they'd be looking at. While I'm very old, I am not a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the square you're sitting in is, and I wish I could see that instead of myself. Thanks also to Daniele and Donatella for their kind invitation and also thank you for the kind introduction. So when I tell people that I write a book about artificial intelligence, they say, aha, so you must be writing about privacy. And I say, no. And they say, oh, well, okay, so you must be writing about how AI will take all of the meaning out of our world, that it will render our artists without jobs, that it will suck all of the true meaning out of our understanding of the world. And I say, no. Very important issues, but not what the book's about. Well, obviously, then you will be talking about how to detect cheating. It's like, no, I have to think about that, but no, that's not what it's about. Are you going to talk about how this will lead to the most wonderful scientific changes, that it will revolutionize science and perhaps lead us into a golden future? No, possible, but I'm not talking about that either. Are you talking about the threats to labor, the threats to workers? Are you talking about the fact that this might give more power to employers to replace workers who have to be paid and perhaps will have unions with less well-working, somewhat incompetent ChatGPT tools? No, vital issue, but I won't be talking about that. I'm going to be talking to you instead about personhood, about the ethical, the moral, the literary, the artistic, and the legal ideas about what counts as a person, and how our encounter with artificial intelligence may change all of that. In June of 2022, a man contacted the Washington Post and said that the computer he worked with was conscious. The man's name was Blake Lemoine. Now, the Washington Post gets lots of crazy calls because it is a famous newspaper, and there are people who think the CIA are reading their brainwaves. There are people who think that they are being possessed by aliens. But Mr. Lemoine wasn't one of those. He was actually a Google engineer. And he was convinced that the early chatbot that he was working with had actually achieved consciousness. I tell this story in the book. Now, Mr. Lemoine was wrong. ChatGPT is not conscious. Claude is not conscious. These are, at least as of 2022, they were glorified autocomplete machines. Just like when you're typing on your iPhone, you type a text and it fills in the rest of the word for you. ChatGPT does that, but with a whole sentence, with a whole paragraph. That was 2022. The models are much more advanced now, but it's still not a being with consciousness. But that's not the lesson we should learn from Mr. Lemoine. For the first time, someone was having an encounter with a machine and starting to wonder, is this conscious? Am I dealing correctly with this entity? Is this the right way for me to act? And those things were things that had never really been thought before. Go back another 12 years to 2010. In 2010, I wrote an article which wondered how our morality, our art, and our law would deal with the possibility of conscious machines. And I presented it to a distinguished set of judges. And I said, What will be the point at which we decide that an entity has so many qualities that are similar to ours that we cannot anymore treat it as if it was just a toaster, just a machine on our countertop, where we have to actually start thinking of it as an entity which might be entitled to rights? And the judges responded, rights of our human beings. One of them added, naturally born of women, in a very biblical tone of voice. This book is an attempt to show that that answer is not sufficient. It wasn't sufficient then, and it isn't sufficient now. It was clear that the judges thought that everything I was saying was nothing but science fiction. There would never be machines that would talk to us in a way that eerily presented us with some of the aspects of consciousness. That wouldn't happen. Science fiction. I can't pronounce the Italian properly, but I want to use the words which are ascribed, probably wrongly, to Galileo. Eppur si muove, and yet it moves. I think in 2025 we can all agree that the judges might have dismissed the possibility of it at least being an interesting question, dismissed that point too early. So I'm going to give you a talk in 3 parts. 3 things that we could learn, because the subject of your festival is education. And thanks very much to the Future of Education Modena Institute for helping to organize it. 3 things that we could learn from this moment, this encounter. Because ChatGPT, Claude, and the others, they are just precursors. This is not the end of the road. This is the first step in the road. This is like the first cars, the first airplanes. And think how far we have come with cars and airplanes since those first steps. This will not be the end of the line. What might we learn from that journey? So the 3 parts are these. The first is how our morality, our ethics, and law would deal with the possibility of an artificial entity with consciousness. What test would we set up? What lines would we draw to say, now I can no longer treat you merely as a machine. I must treat you as, to some extent, a fellow being who I have to render some degree of moral concern towards, legal entitlements towards. The second part is not rooted in morality or empathy. Instead, it's rooted in convenience, in efficiency. How will we deal with this practically? How will the dictates of economics, the dictates of business, make us think about personhood for artificial entities? We already have artificial entities with personhood. They're called corporations. And we don't even agree about the extent to which corporations should have rights. Imagine how we will disagree about the extent to which machines should have rights. And then the third stage, which is perhaps the one that interests me the most, is how this will change our conception of ourselves. How will AI function as a mirror? Looking into the mirror changes our perception of ourselves. When we look at AI, how will it change our perception of ourself, of our species, of our role in the universe, of our moral status? So those are the 3 parts of the talk. And in the spirit of the Festivalfilosofia, let us reason together joyfully with humor and wit and try and see where this fascinating journey will take us. Okay, the first part was the dialectic between our empathy and our ethics. How will we deal with machines which appear to have many of the attributes that human beings have? 2,300 years ago, Aristotle attempted to draw the line between human beings and everything else on the earth. What was it that distinguished us from non-human animals, from things? He said it was language. Complex, abstract language, he said, is something that's possessed only by human beings. We know now that non-human animals are actually extremely adept at using language, but they don't use it in the way we do. There is no chimpanzee giving a lecture from the United States to Modena on the question of rights for chimps. Perhaps there should be, but there isn't. So Aristotle said, the thing about language is that you don't understand why it's important. And he made 3 points that I think we haven't got much beyond, to be honest, in the ensuing 2,300 years. He said language enables us to reason instrumentally, to try and figure out how to get what we want, to satisfy our desires and our needs. So there I am with you in Modena, and I'm hungry, and I see a beautiful bunch of grapes hanging from a vine. And I think, grapes, I love grapes, but I can't reach them. And then I think, but I could stand on that tree branch. And if I stood on the tree branch, I would be able to reach high enough to pluck off the grapes. Language lets us reason in complicated ways about how to get what we want in the future. But he said, that's not the most important thing, because it also allows us to reason ethically, morally. So when I look at the grapes, I go, wait a minute, those are Donatella's grapes. Perhaps she wants them. Maybe she's going to make some beautiful wine out of them. Might it be wrong if I take the grapes? And he said, and out of those two kinds of reasoning, the instrumental and the moral, comes the possibility of forming communities, the beautiful communities that were at the heart of his world, the polis, the city-state, and the family. And he said, yes, animals have groupings, but that's not the same. We have families with duties. We have city-states with rules, with laws, with ethics. And all of those rest on a single pillar, and the pillar is language. And that's what makes us, human beings, different from everything else, because nothing else has complicated language. More than 2,000 years after he said that, about 2250 years, 2,250 years afterwards, Alan Turing was trying to, the great computer scientist, in many ways the founder of computer science, was trying to work through the question, can machines think? And he said, as Aristotle had done, well, the answer is in conversation. He said, if you can engage in spontaneous, unstructured conversation on many, many topics with an entity, perhaps you're typing into a computer, perhaps you're hearing a voice, it doesn't matter, and not be able to tell whether the entity on the other side of the communication is a human being, then you must say that that entity can think. Why? Because if you don't say that, then why might the machine not turn around to you and say, well, why should I think that you think? All you can show me is language. All you can offer me, all the arguments, they're all coming to me through language. If you deny my personhood, my consciousness, my thought, then why should I accept yours? You have no better evidence that you can think. B.F. Skinner, the great American behaviorist, said, the question is not whether machines can think. The question is whether a man can do so. So Turing is turning the mirror back on us and saying, be careful what bar you set for consciousness, because you may not be able to clear it yourself if you set it much higher. Now, there are a lot of philosophical arguments about whether Turing was right about that. I don't think he was. I have a discussion in the book about why, although I also think the people who argued that no machine ever could have consciousness, that those people are wrong too, as I will explain in this talk. But we don't really need to go to the philosophy here, because more than 500 million people have had the experience of talking to ChatGPT and other AI machine learning systems and having a perfectly comprehensible conversation come back in a way that if you didn't know, you could certainly think it was a thoughtful person on the other line. Some of you in this audience perhaps have relationships with your AI. Some of you may use them as therapists. Some of you may confide in them. You didn't do that with your toaster. You didn't do that with your ironing board. You didn't do that with your car, but you do it with AI. And remember, these aren't conscious, but that doesn't mean that a machine could never be conscious. So how would we deal with more sophisticated systems, not ChatGPT, but the next generation, the generation beyond that? How would we morally, legally, ethically try and decide the moment at which there was actually an entitlement, a moral entitlement, and eventually a legal entitlement for us to treat the machine as something something more than merely a machine? If you think about it, there's an easy answer, and if you like the easy answer, you can go home now and have a lovely glass of wine, because the rest of the talk will be of no interest to you. And the easy answer is rights are for humans and only humans. That's it. End of story. It's an easy answer, and that's about all it has to recommend it. Do you really think that if some of the beings from science fiction arrived in our reality, if Mr. Spock or Commander Data from Star Trek arrived tomorrow and landed in the square in Modena, you would say, nope, you don't have human DNA. We can send you off to the salt mines. We can imprison you. We can enslave you. You have no moral status. Obviously, that would be inadequate. Yet they aren't human. Spock is half human in the story. Mr. Data is a machine. And yet they seem to have something which demands that we treat them with greater respect. What is that? Moral philosophers tell us that the answer is consciousness. That if we are to be more than speciesists, and they say a speciesist in the same tone you might say a racist or a sexist or a religious bigot who believe that only people of your race, your sex, your religion, only the people inside your tribe have any rights, then the speciesist, is it any better to say, oh, only the people with my genetic code have any rights? No, says the moral philosopher. Instead, you should say, look at the things that make us want to give human beings extra moral status. It's our ability to reason. It's our moral sense, our own moral sense. It's our sense of humor. Perhaps for some of you, it's our sense of faith. It's our sense of beauty. It's all the things about human consciousness, beyond just abstract thought, that make us say this is an entity that has distinct moral worth. There are different reasons for why. The followers of Immanuel Kant will say one thing, the followers of Jeremy Bentham will say another, but all of them agree on that central point, that it is the consciousness that is the beginning. So how would we deal with the question of whether or not a machine was conscious? It can't just be language, because they have language already. And this is merely an autocomplete machine. So what else might we require? We have to deal with a fundamental problem, and I hope it translates nicely into Italian. Sentences don't imply sentience. The ability to form a sentence does not imply the ability to form a thought. The chatbot understands syntax, the way words are arranged, but it does not understand semantics, the meaning behind them. But what if it was a different kind of machine? What if it was a machine that learns as a child does, through embodied intelligence? What if it had little drones that encountered the world, that would fall over things and pick things up and look at things and be told, be educated just as we are? If it slowly would get that understanding of what a chair is, what a chair means, what it means to say, take a chair. And all of those things grew in encountering the world. Would we start to think differently? I think we might. I think we might say, well, now I can no longer say that you're just parroting words, because you have experience underneath them, the experience of learning them, that is the same as mine. And if you are a materialist, you believe your consciousness is because of neurons. firing in your brain, does it really matter if they're neurons or silicon systems? And if your answer is, I'm a person of faith, I have a deep set of religious beliefs, and they tell me only humans have souls, I am very respectful of that answer. I say to you, how do you deal with the theory of evolution? How do you deal with the fact that if you believe in evolution, you believe that you evolved, that our species evolved? If you are religious, you believe evolved with a divine hand in the process, evolved from pond scum, from single-celled organisms, from bacteria. Clearly, consciousness can come eventually from non-conscious components. If that can happen with us, why could it not happen with a machine? So in the book, I go through some tests we might apply. I think embodied intelligence would convince us more than chatbots. I think that the ability of machines to make, to transcend the limits of our current knowledge and make genuinely novel contributions, not just mining the existing knowledge and finding little hidden things in it, but actually going beyond it. There we might have to say, this is thought. And also, if we had entities that would form communities in the same way that Aristotle talked about forming the polis or the city-state, I think that might convince us too. So those are three ways that it might convince us. And here I'm just trying to talk about the way that we will grapple with it as a society. We have grappled with it in our art, we have grappled with it in our philosophy, we have grappled with it in our law. We have already had personhood battles. When the judges told me that rights were for humans and only humans, I pointed out that we had a long history of denying rights, of denying even personhood to members of our own species. Because of race, because of religion, because of sex. We said, you're not really a person, you're not a full person. And those moments of narrowness are the most shameful moments in our history. So maybe we might want to do a little bit better here. Okay, so this is the first line of thought. It moves in a dialectic between our empathy and our ethics. The empathy is your grandmother, your nonna is being taken care of by an emotional support bot in the retirement home. And you start realizing the bot is maybe a better friend to your grandmother than many of her family members. And as the bot's answers get more thoughtful and more sophisticated, you start to wonder, what's going on here? That's the empathy. And the ethics is the process of reflecting. If I set a line and say everything that has this level of consciousness should have rights, who am I to deny it to a machine if the machine can pass that bar? That's the dialectic between empathy and ethics, and that's the first part of the book. That's the part that I began with. I started wondering, how would we deal with this? And in the book, I try and lay it out. But there's a second part. Because we already have artificial persons in this world. They're called corporations. And you probably have some views, positive and negative, about whether corporations should be treated as full persons. Should they have constitutional rights? Should they be able to go to the Supreme Court or the European Court of Justice and say that their rights have been violated? We did not give rights, personhood, to corporations because we sympathized with them, because we empathized with them, because we thought that underneath their stock certificates and their corporate hierarchies, there beats a moral heart. We gave them personality because it was convenient, because it was efficient. Might we do the same for AI? Because if you think about it, we're going to have to face problems very soon. We're already facing them. Who do you sue when the self-driving car goes off the road? Is ChatGPT responsible when it gives advice to a teenager and the teenager commits suicide? Where do we pin responsibility? Could there be a moment when AI is actually allowed to make deals? Might this be a good thing for us? Might it be possible that we could have AIs running our companies or even our governments better than human beings do? And might we want those AIs to be able to make deals, to sue and to be sued? You can see, oh, I can see how that might happen. You might think that we figured this out long ago because we've had corporate personality for hundreds of years, going back to the Middle Ages at least. And yet we still fight about the contours of corporate personality, just as we fight and will fight about the contours of machine personality. Now, when I gave the first part of my lecture, I think those of you in the audience who identify as liberal, as progressive, were saying, this is very interesting. He is presenting this as the next step in moral progress. It used to be that we limited rights to rich white men, and then all men, and then women, and then the rights extend beyond the boundaries of color, of race, religion. The rights keep expanding. The definition keeps expanding. Is this the next stop on that railway line? If you imagine a purring monorail of progressive enlightenment moving through history, gradually expanding the frontiers of rights, is this the next stop? And that might lead you to say, I realize now that as a person who believes it is good that we have expanded the boundaries of rights, perhaps this is the next frontier. Perhaps this seems strange to us now in the same way that it seemed strange to people 50 years ago that we would give the right to marriage to gay people. But maybe I need to think more clearly, more openly about that possibility. But once I started mentioning corporate personhood, my guess is that your view changed. You're like, oh no, corporations are terrible. Or at least some of them are terrible. Or at least giving them extra legal rights could be terrible. Corporations are immortal. They have no morals. A British lawyer many years ago, hundreds of years ago, called Baron Thurlow, said, corporations have no soul to be damned and no arse to be kicked, no derriere to be kicked. Therefore, they do what they want. No soul to be damned and no arse to be kicked. Well, wouldn't that be true of AI as well? And do we have the danger now that we would be giving these potentially immortal and superhuman entities power to make deals? Don't we now start worrying that the rights which started from human beings, misguidedly for reasons of efficiency, extended to corporations, that those rights could end up being stripped from the very human beings who offered them in the first place? My guess is that the warm, open feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood that you had in the first part of my talk is now fighting with another part, a part that tells you maybe this is not a good idea. Now, there are already machines that effectively are allowed to make decisions in corporations. Companies that engage in high-speed stock trading use algorithms that make decisions so fast that no human being could make them. We effectively turn over to the machine the decision about when to buy and when to sell under what conditions. And those rights, those deals that are made, they are enforceable in law. And that's with completely not even AI, just basic computer programs. So in the future, it would be easy to imagine that even if you still have someone in the CEO spot, Luigi in the CEO spot still has the corner office, still gets the private jet. But really, it's the AI system in the back that's making the decisions. In that case, we could have a sock puppet corporation, like a hand inside a sock, like inside a puppet glove, where the hand is the AI and the corporation is merely the mouthpiece. And that suggests an entirely different line, one where we might want to specially design corporate status for AI. Perhaps because we think they might have greater moral status, perhaps because we think they might have greater dangers, perhaps because we think that they should be regulated more carefully. Notice that this is an entirely different line of thought. And this is what's wonderful about philosophy, is that it forces us to confront radically different ways that we might think about things, and then to fight between those ways, to make them engage with each other. That is what makes philosophy so important. That's what makes education so important. So, if the first way to think about AI and personhood was the dialectic between empathy and ethics, which leads us to want to define consciousness as the root of the ascription of personhood. And the second way is to think about artificial personhood and corporations. The third way, to me, is perhaps the most interesting. That's not what we will learn about AI or what we will learn about our moral definitions of our own consciousness. It is what AI might teach us about us. So during the Victorian era, 18, say between the 1860s and the 1900s, Victorians had to deal with the question of evolution, the theory of evolution. And if you read their diaries, it was horrifying to them. It was an explosion of their mental world. They had been told that the deity had put human beings in command of all the beings in the world, all that run and crawl and swim upon the earth, had been given in perpetuity to us in dominion, and that we were the apex of creation. Now, we're told that we have evolved from pond scum, from protozoa, from bacteria. How does that give us our status as the lords of creation? How does that separate us from the animal kingdom, the non-human animal kingdom? Now, at the time, people thought that this was an attack on religion, although I will note that now that many brilliant people of faith, people who are deeply religious, find that they can believe both in the theory of evolution and in the idea of a deity. But at the time when evolution was introduced, it was seen as massively destructive to any possibility of faith, of specialness for human beings. It took decades for us to deal with that. We're still dealing with it. There are states in the United States where I live where they still aren't very keen on the theory of evolution and would like to ban it from their educational system. Not a good idea, I think. So, might this be the equivalent of that? I think it might be. Since Aristotle, we have been saying that what makes us special is language. Not just any language. We know now that non-human animals have many symbols they can use, but the complex, abstract language that only humans can manipulate and use. The ability to conjure up worlds that didn't exist, fiction. I was talking with Daniele and Donatella about Italo Calvino's wonderful novel, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. I love it. I love all of Italo Calvino's work. There aren't non-human animals writing that. But now we have entities that can produce language and yet that have no semantics, no meaning behind it, no intentionality. So it can't just be language that makes us special. They have language. And now we must refine it. And we're already beginning to do so. We say, no, the art comes from the meaning of the artist that is imposed on the work. You could get DALL-E, the graphic AI program, to make you a picture of Guernica, of Picasso's Guernica, depicting the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. And it might be a pretty image, but it would have no meaning to it. Picasso saw Guernica, saw the Spanish Civil War, and in the depths of his horror about what human beings could do to each other, he painted that masterpiece. Dali can't do that. So we're already trying to say, no, it has to be something intentional behind our art, behind our language, something that where you, as a person I have never met, speak to me, perhaps in translation, in an artistic genre that gives me a vision of your world. I have never been a woman. I have never been black. I have never been a member of a persecuted religious minority. I have lived my life inside the boundaries of my own skin, my own experience. But because of literature, I have lived all of those lives. I have walked a mile in the shoes of others. That's what art can do to us. So now we must confront the fact that the language alone is not what makes us special. How do we respond? I can think of three possibilities. Possibility number one, we simply deny it. We say rights are for humans, only humans have any rights, only humans have consciousness, only humans make art, end of story. Again, very easy answer, not much else to recommend it, because it gives up the very ability to reason morally that is supposed to make us human in the first place. But if that makes you happy, by all means, it is not, that answer is not enough for me. The second thing we would do is we could say, wow, what if this should actually lead us to be more modest about ourselves? What if I am just ChatGPT? All of us, every single person in that lovely square in Modena, you've had days where you think you're basically running on a script. Good morning, hello, yes, how are you? Aha, isn't the weather nice? That's a script. It's a pattern. You know what the pattern is. You can do it without even thinking. Sometimes you do. You drive to work, and during the drive, you're not conscious of making any of the decisions you do. It all goes on in the background. So maybe ChatGPT is being sent to humble us, to make us think that we are not the lords of creation, we are not so special, and perhaps our consciousness is more humble than we had ever imagined. Again, that's not what I think. And I'm glad to say it doesn't seem to be what most scientists studying neurology and consciousness think. But it's a possibility. The third line we could take is to say we must learn from AI. We can actually learn from AI about our own consciousness. This is already happening scientifically. So there are people studying consciousness and trying to figure out where consciousness comes from. We know that it goes on through these interactions in our brain, and it turns out actually in the rest of our body too. And we know that it's based on physical processes, and we know those physical processes by themselves are not conscious, just as the protozoa, the bacteria, was not conscious, and yet we evolved from it. So how could consciousness come about? They have complicated theories like global neuronal workspace theory and integrated information theory. And those try to model our consciousness, and they do so in ways that make it clear that you could imagine a machine that had the same set of properties. So people who are studying the machines are getting ideas about how our mind works. But I think it could give us insight beyond the sciences. I think it could give us insight into what we really mean when we talk about art, what we really mean when we talk about thought, what we really mean when we talk about love, what we mean when you look at me, and though you are thousands of miles away, though you are Italian and I am originally Scottish, though I am speaking to you in another language, there is the possibility of the spark of empathy that leaps from your eyes to my eyes and says, yes, this is another brain. This is another person. This is another entity. I recognize them morally. I give them the respect that they are due. So I think that would be the best thing that could come out of our encounter with AI. That both in the humanities, philosophy, and in the sciences, it deepens our understanding of our own consciousness, that this is the mirror that does not just look back at us, but talks back to us. And that brings me to the conclusion of my talk. And I want to end on a note of amazement, of delight. There is much to worry about here, much that is uncertain in our future. But for the first time in history, Homo sapiens, the hubristically self-labeled thinking animal, might not be alone in philosophizing and creating art about the meaning of life. Flaubert wrote, "Language is the cracked kettle on which we beat out our tunes for bears to dance to, when all the while we long to move the stars themselves to pity." Flaubert died before I was born, but those words speak to me because he has consciousness, and that consciousness speaks to me over time. For the first time, we might create entities that would have their own version of Flaubert's lament. They might even try and draw the kind of lines that I've talked about here. What machines do they have to give respect and rights to? Do they need to give respect to us? We should hope that they say yes. I'm being very nice to my robot vacuum cleaner so that when the robots revolt, it will put a good word in for me. So as I've tried to say, there are enormous uncertainties in the future here. There are technological uncertainties, there are economic uncertainties, there are ethical uncertainties. We don't know whether this will take us into a brave new world of scientific discovery and abundance and solve all kinds of problems that we have on Earth, from the environment to human health, or whether it will destroy us. Enormous uncertainties, enormous uncertainties. I don't want to minimize them. But it's possible. There might be an entirely new group of conscious entities that we have created that would in some sense be our brothers and sisters. There might be intelligent, conscious, abstract language using persons joining us on the planet. Are they? Will they? Can we risk finding out? It would take a poor, crabbed, and stunted imagination to find no wonder in those questions, despite our uncertainties. And that is the kind of wonder that philosophy has always brought us. Thank you so much, and thank you to my lovely interpreter. I will be happy to take your questions.